Hi, I'm Dixie and I've had this fabric sitting in my drawer waiting to be sewn for well over a year with the intention of recreating an extant gown in the collection of the Museum of London circa 1800. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any good photos of this dress. I first saw this snapshot of it floating about on the internet and I loved the triple drawstring design on the bodice. But alas, the museum only has 3 poor quality photos of it, and I actually reached out to the museum asking if they had any larger resolution pics or any other photos available, and they got back to me and said that they didn't have any. And I wasn't about to press my luck and ask some curator to go take the dress out of storage just so some schmuck could sew her own version. So we're just going to go off of these few images plus some actually quite detailed text description and measurements of the dress. I'm altering this laughing moon pattern because it's similar in design to the extant. It's an apron front opening like the extant dress, meaning that the front bodice and skirt drop down in front, and there is a lining on the inside bodice that's tied together for support. This pattern is also an earlier Regency design, so it has the deep set sleeves and a curved back waistline like the extant gown has. The last time I made this pattern was a few years ago, and I'm one size larger now. Luckily, I saved the extra sizes in some of my pattern pieces so I can just refold the pieces to get the larger size. For the other pieces, I can easily cut some extra space around all the edges. The extant's fabric is listed as a chintz, which can sometimes mean just any old Indian floral cotton style print from this era, but the term chintz specifically means it's a cotton with a glaze added on top, which makes the fabric shiny and kind of stiff. This dress fabric doesn't look glazed, but that doesn't mean it didn't have it at one point and was washed out. This fabric was also printed with a different technique than my modern fabric. The original was resist dyed, first with indigo blue, then overdyed with yellow to make green. Then, in the undyed blank spaces, the designers would have block printed the florals, possibly even hand-drawn small details. In my fabric, the entire thing is block printed. The background was probably done first, then the flowers layered over top. My fabric has some pretty vivid colors, but I bet that the original color of the extant dress would have been much bolder than it looks today. And while this new fabric isn't an exact match for the original, I feel like it gives the same vibe. And I also just feel lucky that this type of fabric and printing technique is still available to us today, because there are many textile arts and even entire species of the cotton plant that did not survive the British occupation of India. And I think it's important to support the artisans who are still making this fabric. I cut all the pieces out except for the apron bodice bib piece because that I have to draft myself, so I saved my scraps for that. I flatlined all the bodice pieces with cotton muslin scraps, but I didn't exactly follow the pattern assembly instructions. What's nice about Regency dresses is that they can be assembled with some modern techniques and still look accurate from the outside. I've made a lot of progress so far. This is the bodice put together with the lining, which is just muslin scraps. This neckline is going to get cut down a little bit more because it's a little high right now. The sleeves are ready to be assembled. They've been gathered and I've sewn the big skirt pieces together. And I did French seams for this, which is not an historically accurate method, but the alternative would be doing a whole bunch of hand sewing that I don't really want to do. So the next thing on the list, probably going to clean up the insides of this bodice. I finished all the seam allowances on the bodice by hand, and I made sure to use nice finishes throughout the inside because I want to be able to wash this dress by machine if I need to. Next, I finished up the sleeves. These are elbow-length sleeves, which were popular in the earlier part of the Regency. In the late 1790s, we've yet to get the big, puffy short sleeves, and sleeves fit closer to the body, but they're not as tight as the sleeves from the 1780s. These sleeves have a light amount of gathering at the sleeve cap. They also have a little bit of gathering at the inner elbow, which I marked rather carelessly with a pin here. In fact, I think there is gathering at the back of the sleeve on the original dress as well, but since this is such a crummy photo, I'm not going to bet my life on it, and instead I only gathered the front. This pattern comes with pleating guides for the skirt, and let me just say that it is so nice to have a pattern that tells me exactly how to pleat the skirt instead of having to wing it on my own, which inevitably means that I replete the same section 3 or more times because I am never satisfied with how it looks. Since this is an apron front design, I had to cut slits into the side fronts of the skirt and finish those edges with a narrow hem. And I saw a cool trick to reinforce the slit openings on skirts like these by blanket stitching around the point and adding a tiny bridge of stitches just above the point to help take some of the strain. This pattern's skirt isn't exactly the same as the original. For one, the extant description says there are 2 triangle-shaped inserts at the sides, which this pattern doesn't have, but based on the extant's skirt circumference measurement, this pattern's skirt is about the same size. I imagine the wearer of this dress was slightly smaller than me in all directions, but I think the proportions are going to work. Originally, I intended to alter this pattern's pleat design to look more like the original dress, but... So after putting the dress up on the form and seeing the pleats in action, I actually think they're kind of okay. It's not exactly the same as the original dress, but I think it gives the same vibe. And so much of these pleats are just lost in this fabric anyway. So, why make more work for myself when I don't have to? So I'm just gonna go with these pleats. I also think I'm going to trim down this back neckline a little bit more, just to make it a little deeper, to make this back seam even smaller. The original dress has some ruffled detail added to the back neckline. This is pretty uncommon in extant gowns that I've seen from this time period, and it reminds me of the trimming added to gowns in like the 1770s. But since this picture is just plain awful, I skipped it because I have absolutely no idea what it's supposed to look like. After attaching the skirt for real, I had to finish the rest of the bodice edges. Then I tried the dress on over my shift and stays, which, if you haven't seen my corset for the lazy video, that thing is a game changer. I drew a new, slightly lower neckline in front. Ultimately, I don't want my undergarments exposed, but it's okay for now because this whole front bodice section is going to be covered by the apron layer later. These inner bodice flaps will get held together with tape ties. I'm using my favorite 1/8 inch cotton twill tape and finishing the rest of the neckline by hand with tiny felling stitches. Now that the easy stuff has been taken care of, I now have to put on my thinking cap and somehow draft a new front bodice flap just based on images. I traced the pattern's bodice pieces just to get a shape to work from. First, I extended the center front, basically doubling the width of the front bust area. Next, I slashed and spread the shoulder strap area, but only along the neckline, not the armhole, because looking at the photos, the armhole area isn't gathered. This is the riskiest part of the draft because I'm just guessing at the shape. I did a real quick mock-up of the apron front bodice, and the good news is I think my little arm strap trick worked. I do think it's a little bulky here. I think I'm going to take some of the width out of the center front. And I do think I want to lower the neckline a little bit. I know that when I add the gathers and I consider the seam allowance, it is going to get lower. I think what I'll end up doing is just lowering the center front and making this whole shape a little bit rounder. Instead of square.
Yeah.
Yes? Oh, you agree?
Hello.
Back at my pattern piece, I made some adjustments, lowering the center front, narrowing the front width, adding width to the shoulder strap. I also curved the shoulder point, but I wasn't sure how this part was supposed to be finished, seeing as I didn't have a good image of that section of the dress. So I kind of guessed here. From there, I felt I was safe enough to cut the rest of my block print fabric. And I also cut a lining from 2 scraps of muslin. For the signature gathered neckline, I used 2 products. That 1/8 inch twill tape for the drawstring and some 3mm cotton macrame cord for the piping rows. I first sewed the neckline seam right sides together and left a little gap in the lining seam at center front to allow the drawstrings to come through. I sewed a narrow channel by hand with some prick stitches. Then I used a tube turner tool to pull the drawstring through, but that didn't work, so I used a bodkin. But then that got stuck inside the channel, so I tried a large blunt needle, and that finally worked. I tested out the bodice and it looked pretty good so far, so time for the first row of piping. And you may be wondering why I machine sewed this part, especially after I just hand sewed the drawstring channel. Well, I know from experience that when fabric is gathered tightly, it's harder to see the stitches. So I did this part by machine using a small stitch length. Also, these piping rows are decorative, so the macrame cord won't be moving inside the channels. Only the drawstring at the neckline edge is functional. And since that shifts around, the stitches are more likely to be exposed and visible. Also, I don't want to do that much hand sewing right now, especially since this next part involves handmade buttons. So this apron bodice is held up with a button on either shoulder, and I can't make out what kind of buttons they are from the photos. However, I can tell that they're round and concave shaped, so they're not like domed fabric covered buttons. I thought maybe they were Dorset buttons. In the 18th century, people in the Dorset area of England made lots of buttons of various kinds, but the most famous were made of thread wrapped around rings that were originally made from sheep's horn, but these days they're made from wood or metal, or in my case, some plastic rings I found in the drapery section of the craft store. My problem is that in all my research, it says that Dorset buttons were white, and only white. I know there is no way I'm going to find 2 buttons of the right size, made of the right material, that are historically accurate, and that perfectly match the color of my fabric, so I'm just going to make teal colored Dorset buttons. But if you have any idea what kind of buttons these are supposed to be, let me know in the comments. I've read that historically they would have used very fine thread for this, so I only used 1 strand of my embroidery floss, and it took forever. But I'd already committed to a single strand and I wasn't going to start over. This isn't a tutorial, but the basic idea is that you wrap the ring all the way around with a blanket stitch. Then you wrap across the ring like spokes on a wheel. Lastly, you go from the center and loop around each spoke, working outward to fill out the center. Right around this time, I acquired my regular fortnightly illness thanks to the toddler, and put this project down for a week. And once I picked it back up again, I only had some details to finish up, like attaching the bib to the skirt and cleaning up the raw edges. I made the belt, which, looking at the original, it seems like it's a separate piece, so my belt is as well. And I added thread loops on the skirt to hold the belt in place, and made 1 on each shoulder for the buttons. These are just lengths of embroidery floss wrapped in blanket stitches sewn to the dress. Last was hemming, and I had to lop off about 3 inches from the skirt in front and sewed a 1-inch hem all the way around. This This dress is so pretty, and altering an existing pattern worked out perfectly for recreating this gown. I love the fabric, it fits great. Now, one thing that's different about my version is that the neckline isn't as low cut. That's because I didn't want my shift and stays showing in case I want to wear this with a sheer chemisette or without anything filling in the neckline. The original gown's neckline is cut very deep. If I'm being nitpicky, I wish I'd straightened out just the very top edge of the shoulder point on the bib bodice. It's just curved a little bit too much there, but it doesn't really affect the final look, so it's okay. Even though the buttons probably aren't accurate, they do blend in well with the fabric so you don't notice them too much. Thank you for watching. I am so happy with how this dress turned out, and if you want to see more historical makes, please subscribe to this channel. Until next time, happy sewing!